take some time to get through. For those of you who are on the Whitney mixed use or on the Connections Housing, we definitely will not be getting back to you until well after 1 o'clock. So if you'd like to leave now, that would be fine. Okay, you ready to present?
And there they go.
Good morning, Commissioners. I'm Stephen Hill, City Council staff for District 3. And with me today is Alex Cripe, Chair of the Medical Marijuana Task Force. And before you is the ordinance to regulate medical marijuana dispensaries. The ordinance would define the term medical marijuana dispensary and establish a process by which dispensaries can be permitted in the city of San Diego. The ordinance would limit medical marijuana dispensaries to the industrial light zone, IL3-1, and I apologize because there's a typo in the staff report indicating IL1-3, but it's 3-1. Also the industrial small lot zone, IS1-1, and in the community commercial zones, which allow lodgekeepers' quarters as the only permitted residential use. Those are CC 2-1, 2-2, and 2-3. It would make all applications for a medical marijuana dispensary subject to a process 4 conditional use permit, and would require that the dispensary be located at least 1,000 feet from schools, playgrounds, libraries, child care facilities, youth facilities, churches, parks, and other dispensaries. The ordinance would also impose requirements and restrictions regarding signage, security, lighting, and hours of operation. As background, this ordinance has its roots in the recommendation of the Medical Marijuana Task Force, which was established by the City Council in October of 2009 to advise the Council on, among other things, land use and zoning of medical marijuana dispensaries within the City of San Diego. The task force developed their land use recommendations over the course of 5 public meetings, and their report was presented to the City Council Committee on Land Use and Housing on March 24th, 2010. LUNH directed the City Attorney to draft the ordinance before you. To touch on some of the details of the ordinance, the zones in which medical marijuana dispensaries would be allowed are highlighted in your backup material. Attachment number 2 shows the location of the community commercial CC 2-3 zones, the light industrial IL3 zones, and the industrial small lot IS zones throughout the city. It should be noted that the ordinance would also permit dispensaries in community commercial CC 2-1 and 2-2 zones, but there are no parcels with this zone designation in the city of San Diego. The Medical Marijuana Task Force recommended that dispensaries be allowed in all commercial and industrial zones, but the Land Use and Housing Committee chose to limit them to commercial zones that do not permit residential except for watchkeepers' quarters. And the IL3 and IS zones were selected because they allow a mix of light industrial, office, and commercial uses that seem to have a nexus with medical marijuana dispensaries, including permitting medical, dental, and health practitioners, pharmaceuticals, and the processing and packaging of plant products grown off premises. In addition to zone limitations, the siting of the medical marijuana dispensary would be further restricted under the ordinance by a required distance separation of 1,000 feet from schools, parks, churches, child care facilities, playgrounds, libraries owned and operated by the City of San Diego, youth serving facilities, and other medical marijuana dispensaries. Attachment 3 in your backup illustrates a 1,000-foot radius around the known locations of these uses. It should be noted that this map contains only the distance separated uses that can be identified with the SanGIS mapping technology, and it should not be considered a comprehensive analysis of where these uses are located. If the ordinance is approved and an application to site a medical marijuana dispensary is submitted, the Development Services Department will conduct a case-by-case survey to determine if a given location meets all of the distance separation requirements. The ordinance contains requirements and restrictions on signage, security, lighting, and hours of operation as well. Signs would be required outside of the business and may contain only the name of the business and be limited to 2 colors. The name and contact information of an operator or manager will be required to be posted so that it's visible from outside the dispensary. Appropriate security, including operable cameras, alarms, and a security guard would be required. The security guard will be licensed in the state of California and will be present during business hours. Lighting will be required to illuminate the interior of the dispensary, the facade, and the immediate surrounding area, including any accessory uses, parking lots, and adjoining sidewalks. Dispensaries would be permitted to operate only between the hours of 7 a.m. to 9 p.m., 7 days a week. I want to clarify a statement from the staff report that indicates that the ordinance reflects the motion passed by the Land Use and Housing Committee. This is true, except that the committee asked that proof of nonprofit status be required as a condition of the CUP. However, as noted in the city attorney's report, conditional use permits create a right that attaches to the land, not to any individual permittee. Therefore, this recommendation was not included in the ordinance. A separate ordinance concerning the public safety aspects of medical marijuana facilities is being prepared for consideration by the City Council and is expected to be heard concurrently with the land use ordinance. Testimony at the City Council as well as the advisory groups has reflected a broad spectrum of public opinion as to the level of restriction that is appropriate to site medical marijuana facilities. While the ordinance before you is based on the motion passed by the Land Use and Housing Committee and initiated by the City Council, numerous alternatives have been suggested throughout the public process. The Planning Commission may wish to consider the suggestions of the Medical Marijuana Task Force, the Code Monitoring Team, and the Community Planners Committee when making its recommendation to the City Council. The Medical Marijuana Task Force report includes the following recommendations that are distinct from the ordinance. They recommended that collectives and cooperatives be allowed in all commercial and industrial zones, no distance requirements for parks or churches, 500-foot distance requirement between dispensaries. Dispensaries with fewer than 100 members would obtain a use permit through process 2, and dispensaries with 100 or more members would obtain a use permit through process 3. The Code Monitoring Team made the following recommendations. The distance requirement for medical marijuana dispensaries should be the same distance used for off-site sales of alcohol, which is 600 feet from schools, playgrounds, public parks, and churches, and 100 feet from residentially zoned properties. They also recommended that dispensaries should be permitted in all commercial zones regardless of whether or not residential uses are present, since the ordinance does not treat residential uses as a sensitive use with distance requirements. Medical marijuana dispensaries should be permitted in all industrial zones that allow retail uses such as pharmacies. And dispensaries should be a conditional use permit approval via process 3 with appeal to the Planning Commission. The Community Planners Committee made the following recommendations. They recommended to include a 1,000-foot buffer between medical marijuana dispensaries and colleges or universities. They recommended that community planning groups be permitted to request a waiver to the regulations to allow for more locations for dispensaries in their communities with approval of the community planning group, and to allow collectives and cooperatives to continue to operate for up to 1 year after passage of the ordinance while going through the process to obtain a permit. And finally, the staff recommendation is that you recommend that the City Council approve the ordinance as drafted. And this concludes my report.
Okay, thank you. Now, are there any clarifying questions before I start the public testimony? Yes, Commissioner Lyon.
Question for Mr. Hill. When is the ordinance for public safety scheduled to be ready?
It's planned to be heard concurrently with the land use ordinance.
When would that be?
It depends on when we can get it scheduled after this year.
Could you also clarify what is being covered in the public safety ordinance versus what we're seeing here today? I want to make sure that we focus our energy on what the ordinance is in front of us. So if you wouldn't mind kind of clarifying those points.
I'm going to have to refer that to either the city attorney or to Alex.
The task force made additional recommendations with respect to public safety issues. Those deal with issues such as verifying the not-for-profit operation of medical marijuana dispensaries. Under state law, medical marijuana dispensaries have to operate on a not-for-profit basis. It also included provisions in terms of verifying closed-circuit operations, so to speak. In other words, medical marijuana dispensaries are considered to be collectives and cooperatives under state law. They have to operate on a closed-circuit basis such that they obtain the medical marijuana from patient members and only distribute medical marijuana to patient members. So there's those sorts of things that are going to include that. Ms. Thomas has additional, can explain in more detail the current draft that's underway.
I believe there are also background investigation requirements contained in that ordinance. Different deputies working on that ordinance in our office. I haven't been hands-on with that, but it's the operator requirements as opposed to the actual use of the land in certain zones.
Okay, thank you. Are there other clarifying questions? Yes, Commissioner Spillane?
I just have a question on a couple of terms used in the report. In the task force's alternative, you talk about whether it's process 2 or process 3, depending on the number of members. Could you define a member?
Yeah, in terms of members, under, again, under sort of state law, medical marijuana dispensaries are really collectives and cooperatives. And so in order to receive medical marijuana from a dispensary, one has to become a member of that dispensary. In other words, a member of the collective or cooperative. So they would have to, generally speaking, this would entail sort of signing that form to officially become a member of that collective or cooperative. In terms of the city level oversight of the public safety section of the ordinance, I think goes further into detail about membership, because that really sort of covers the closed circuit operations, the oversight of that issue. And so the oversight of closed circuit operations gets, I think, a little bit further into detail about what constitutes a member of a medical marijuana dispensary.
Thank you. The other question is probably irrelevant, but what's a watchkeeper's quarters?
Watchkeepers' quarters are living quarters for watchkeepers. They're restricted to 1,200